All right, we're back on a conversation. Now, an old friend's back with us, progressive activist, original co-founder of Democracy Spring, Kai Newkirk. Kai, great to have you back on, brother.
Great to be with you, Cenk, as always. Appreciate it.
Yep. Whenever we check in with you, you're leading some sort of protest, which I love. In fact, I participated in a couple. In this case, you did one recently regarding coronavirus, but you know a lot of the right-wing protests are getting attention in the news because they're carrying weaponry and basically threatening people's lives, etc. So what did a left-wing protest in the midst of coronavirus look like?
You know, this was an experiment, I would say. And as we were approaching, starting to hear about what Pelosi was working on in the House in terms of the next relief bill. I felt like there needed to be some effort to intervene in that process and get to a better result than the prior bills. And my sense about that was, one, there needed to be more of a push to progressives in the House to really draw the line and fight and use their leverage to get to a better bill and get what we really need in there. And two, that if we were going to make that happen, we needed grassroots progressives, we needed the progressive movement to challenge Democrats and progressives to do so in a more forceful way. And I felt like that wasn't going to be possible unless we went beyond a lot of the digital protests that happened and that had been happening during the pandemic. And it's obviously a really difficult question. How do you responsibly, safely protest publicly during a pandemic? Maybe you can't. That's an understandable position. And I had participated in one car-based protest at a immigrant detention center here in Arizona, fighting to get folks released from detention to be safe, and helped to amplify several of those around the country. And I think it's a good tool. But I felt like we needed to try and see if we could do something safely that went beyond that and brought people out physically in person in public. And also seeing the really reckless, just senseless reopen protests, which I understand some of the needs those are speaking to, but to do so in a way where people are coming together, not physically distancing, not wearing masks, threatening people, even disregarding the risk of the virus, obviously is very dangerous. And I felt like that was kind of monopolizing the space of protest and really moving our politics in the wrong direction. So felt like there needed to be a response. And so, reached out and brought just independent, individual organizers together in different parts of the country who agreed. I reached out to some organizations. There wasn't really much of a willingness or readiness to take this kind of step. But we felt like we needed to try it and do it. And so the safety protocol that we came up with, and after, this was after a lot of conversation, really grappling with the question of whether it's the right thing to do to try to do any kind of public protest right now. And where we came down was a feeling that the risk to people is already there. Frontline workers working without protection, there's nothing that's going to help them in the status quo right now, right? And there's so many people suffering that the question of whether this bill is going to really meet the need or not is so important that it was worth taking some very calculated, managed risk to try to get to a better result. And so the plan that we came up with to try to do that was inspired by protests in Israel and Portugal and other places around the world that really did rigorous physical distancing. And so we said, we're going to create a grid, at least 9 feet of space in between everybody that's pre-marked in the area where we're going to be protesting, require that everyone have a mask or cloth face covering, require that everyone go through a Zoom video call briefing on the protocol beforehand, maintain physical distancing while coming and going, no exchange of materials, ask people who might be high risk not to participate. And we didn't organize it publicly. We didn't put out the location so just anybody could show up, which obviously makes it much more difficult to get more people there. But we wanted to have a standard for safety that we felt like would be unimpeachable. And so that's what we came up with. And the actions were small and they happened in few places, but I think we were successful in showing that we could do so and do it responsibly, do it safely.
Well, some progressives did wind up raising a challenge to that bill. So let's go to the substance of it. What was wrong with the bill in your estimation, Guy?
Yeah, well, we saw as it was the there were kind of leaks of what was likely to be in the released bill, the draft bill. And then when it came out, we saw that there was a lot of really good stuff in it, which is a testament to the fact that progressives were fighting harder this time, especially in response to the last bill. So there was so much good stuff in that, and we celebrate that, claim that as progressive victories. But there were things that are really essential and important that were left out, like Pramila Jayapal's Paycheck Guarantee Act, which is the best way to stop the mass layoffs that are happening and do so retroactively, get a lot of people back to work. Like making the direct cash relief, which is essential because so many people are not able to access unemployment insurance, making that monthly and making it larger, so $2,000 a month rather than $1,200, and addressing the healthcare need that still so many people who need COVID treatment can't have that covered. So we need free COVID treatment for all, which is the bare minimum you could ask for in terms of healthcare. Really, we should have covering all uninsured and underinsured costs through Medicare, opening up Medicare right now. So we felt like those were some of the bare essential and popular pieces that were missing, and we were pushing progressives to draw the line. And you're right that I think it was a really important step that a bigger group of them did. We said we're trying to create a hashtag People's Bailout Bloc. That's what we called this effort to organize these protests. And in the end, we went from one person, AOC, to 9 progressives who voted in that block. And I think it was a really important test of where progressives are at in the House and really using their leverage to enter even into conflict at times with the Democratic leadership to make bills better. And I think it was a big step forward. And there were some surprising absences, from that list, like Raul Grijalva, a Justice Democrat here in Arizona, who didn't vote with them. But I was proud of those folks. I think it was courageous, and it's something that we can build on. Obviously, it was not enough by a slim margin to stop the vote and force improvements. But still, I think it was an important success in building up progressive power in Congress that they took that stand.
How responsive do you think the progressive legislators have been to progressive groups? Is there a need to put pressure on, or are they ready for the fight before anyone else is, et cetera? Really open-ended here, but what's your take on it, Guy?
Well, I think it's obviously, I would say, a big spectrum, right? If you look at the Progressive Caucus, we're talking, some 90 members, right, who have a real range of the values and policies they push for, how they approach governing, how they campaign, et cetera. There's some leaders, like a Pramila Jayapal, for example, obviously like an AOC, who I think are, sometimes ahead of the progressive groups. We saw that this time, that the Progressive Caucus co-chairs came out and demanded that the bill be delayed, be better, and several progressive organizations were already ready to accept it as is. But I think a lot of others really need to be pushed and need to be given support to see that there's a real demand that they can step out and not be on their own. Some of them, maybe have to be pushed in a harder way. But I think it's a real spectrum. But to me, when we have a problem like the fact that these bills haven't been good enough, the solution never starts, for me, with members of Congress. It starts with the movement. That's where it's got to be driven from. And that's where I feel like we haven't been coordinated enough. We haven't been united enough. We haven't been aggressive enough. And we haven't worked hard enough and used all of our tools at our disposal. And I think there was progress on that with this round, which obviously is not done, but it's not enough. And so now the fight is going to be to pass something through the Senate, get it signed, period, that keeps all of the good stuff in this, like extending unemployment insurance, the Essential Bill of Workers, Essential Workers Bill of Rights provisions, the inclusion of immigrants, vote by mail, funding for U.S. Postal Service, et cetera, and then adds in the things that need to be there that are missing and strips out some of the bad things like the corporate lobbyist bailout. That's a tall order, but it's only going to happen if progressive organizations fight, demand it of Democrats in the Senate, really push Republicans and mobilize the public to isolate them around the untenable position of not fighting for reform and to deliver more relief right now. And it's going to require, I think, doing additional protests.
Are progressives too hard to organize? I've seen it, different groups that don't want to work together, partly out of egos. And then there's different things that float around like cancel culture, and then all the groups cancel one another. And the next thing you know, nobody's got each other's back. Is that overstated, or is that a real phenomenon in the progressive community?
Look, there's a lot of challenges, no doubt about it. And I think any culture, any subculture has strengths to it that make it easier to come together and organize for good things, and it has weaknesses. And I think we've got a lot of good things going for us and some challenges. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily harder. I do think less of an orientation around discipline, around strategic unity, more of a sense of, following our individual paths. There's some things that maybe make it more difficult than on the right. But we've got values of caring and compassion that make it, I think, much easier. So I'm hopeful. I believe in us. We're going to continue to organize more protests, this People's Bailout Bloc formation. If you want to be part of it, send me a DM on Twitter, Kai_Newkirk. We haven't created a website or anything. It's been very informal and ad hoc, but nonetheless, real committed folks doing this work, working hard for the right reasons, and we're going to push forward. And I'm hopeful. I think a key thing I'll add on your bigger point there to finish is that something I think really important for progressives, you can apply this to the primary, you can apply this to this fight, is to have an ethic of learning from our experiences.
And for God's sake, let's work together. And Kai has done a great job of bringing people together in the past, including in Democracy Spring. So yes, follow him on Twitter and you'll see the latest protests almost always. Kai Newkirk, as always, thanks for joining us on the Young Turks. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Cenk. Great to be with you.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.